Imagine flying at 85,000 feet, so high that you can see the curvature of the earth beneath you, the sky above you fading from deep blue into the absolute black of space. And you are moving so fast that if someone fired a surface-to-air missile at you, the only thing your pilot needs to do is push the throttle forward and simply outrun it. No evasive maneuvers, no countermeasures deployed, no panic, just speed. Pure, raw, terrifying speed. You are traveling at what they created was nothing short of miraculous. The State Route 71 was constructed primarily from titanium, a metal that was extraordinarily difficult and expensive to work with in the 1960s, because titanium was the only material that could withstand the brutal temperatures generated by flying at Mach 3. At those speeds, aerodynamic friction heats the leading edges of the wings to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and the skin of the fuselage reaches temperatures that would cause aluminum, the standard material of aircraft construction, to lose its structural integrity completely and simply fall apart. The engineers at Skunk Works had to develop entirely new manufacturing techniques, entirely new tools, and entirely new processes just to work with titanium at the scale they needed. And here is perhaps the most extraordinary irony in the entire story. The titanium they needed was sourced largely from the Soviet Union, their primary adversary, smuggled through various front companies and third-party nations. The Americans were essentially building their most secret spy plane using materials purchased from the very country they intended to spy on. The engines that powered the State Route 71 were themselves works of art and engineering madness. The Pratt & Whitney J58 engines were unlike anything ever built before or since. They were not purely jet engines in the conventional sense. At low speeds, they operated as turbojet engines. But as the aircraft accelerated past Mach 2.2, the engines transitioned into a configuration that was closer to a ramjet, bypassing much of the conventional turbine machinery and essentially using the forward momentum of the aircraft itself as part of the compression system. This made them extraordinarily powerful at high speeds, but also extraordinarily temperamental. Starting the engines required a special external starting cart, a vehicle called the AGM start cart that used two Buick Wildcat V8 engines connected together to spin the SR-71's turbines fast enough to initiate combustion. The fuel itself, a specially developed substance called JP7, had such a high flash point that you could literally drop a lit match into a bucket of it, and the match would go out. The fuel needed a chemical called triethylborane, or TB, to ignite it, and each aircraft carried only a limited supply of TB, meaning the pilot could only restart the engines a specific number of times during any given flight. The SR-71's design was also years, perhaps decades, ahead of its time in terms of stealth. Kelly Johnson understood that radar cross-section reduction would be critical, and the Blackbird's distinctive shape, with its chins, its tilted engines, and its overall geometry, was carefully engineered to scatter radar signals rather than reflect them back to the source. The dark, matte black paint that gave the aircraft its nickname was not merely cosmetic. It was a specialized thermal coating designed to radiate heat away from the aircraft's skin. By the time the State Route 71 entered operational service in 1966, it represented perhaps the single greatest concentration of cutting-edge technology ever assembled in one flying machine. And for the next 2 decades, it performed its mission with a reliability and effectiveness that was nothing short of extraordinary. In its entire operational history, spanning thousands of missions and millions of flight miles, not a single State Route 71 was ever lost to enemy action. Not one. Over 900 surface-to-air missiles were fired at SR-71s over the course of its career. Every single one missed. Every time a missile was detected, the pilot simply pushed the throttle forward and flew away from it. The aircraft set an absolute speed record that stands to this very day, 2,193 miles per hour, a record set in 1976 that has never been broken by any aircraft in the history of aviation. So given all of that, given this utterly extraordinary, irreplaceable, invincible machine, why would any rational military organization decide to retire it? The official answer, the one the Air Force gave to Congress and to the public, was cost. The State Route 71 was expensive to operate. Each flight hour cost approximately $200,000 in 1980s money. The aircraft required enormous amounts of specialized maintenance, specialized fuel, specially trained pilots, and a support infrastructure that was unique to this one aircraft type. In an era of budget pressure, when the Cold War was winding down and the Berlin Wall was about to fall, it was easy to point to those numbers and say, look, we simply cannot justify this expense anymore. And many people accepted that explanation. Many aviation historians accepted it. Many retired military officers accepted it. But the truth is far more complex, far more political, and far more interesting than a simple budget calculation. Because the real story of why the State Route 71 was retired is a story about power, about institutional rivalry, about the rise of a completely new form of intelligence gathering, and about a series of decisions made in secret rooms by people whose names most of the public has never heard. To understand the real reasons, you have to go back to the 1960s and the birth of the American reconnaissance satellite program. Even while the State Route 71 was being developed, the intelligence community was investing massively in a parallel technology, spy satellites. The Corona program, which was classified for decades, launched America's first successful reconnaissance satellite in August of 1960. In that single mission, Corona returned more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union than all previous U-2 flights combined. The implications of that fact took years to fully sink in within the intelligence community, but when they did, they fundamentally changed the strategic landscape in ways that would eventually make the State Route 71 obsolete in the eyes of certain very powerful people. Satellites, unlike aircraft, did not need to penetrate sovereign airspace. They operated in outer space, above the recognized boundary of national sovereignty, and therefore could not be legally or diplomatically challenged by the nations being photographed. They could not be shot down by surface-to-air missiles. They did not require pilots who could be captured and subjected to the kind of humiliation that the Gary Powers incident had caused. And with each passing year through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, satellite technology was improving at a breathtaking pace. By the late 1970s, the National Reconnaissance Office, the highly secretive agency responsible for American spy satellites, was operating systems of such extraordinary capability that their resolution, their coverage, and their collection capacity were beginning to seriously challenge the SR-71's unique value proposition. The KH-11 Cannon satellite, which became operational in 1976, was the first American satellite capable of transmitting digital images back to Earth in near real time, rather than the old system of physically ejecting film canisters from orbit and recovering them in midair over the Pacific Ocean. This was a revolutionary development. For the first time, decision-makers in Washington could look at satellite imagery that was hours old rather than days or weeks old. And the people who managed and funded those satellite programs, primarily officials within the CIA and the National Reconnaissance Office, were increasingly making the argument that the State Route 71 was redundant, that satellites could do everything the Blackbird could do, and do it without the political risks, without the diplomatic complications, and without the massive operational costs. But here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because this was not simply a technical debate about which intelligence gathering tool was superior. It was a ferocious institutional power struggle, a battle over billions of dollars in budget allocation, over prestige, over control of America's intelligence apparatus. The CIA, which had originally created the U-2 and had been deeply involved in the early development of what became the State Route 71 family of aircraft, had a strong institutional interest in promoting satellite reconnaissance, because the CIA had enormous influence over the National Reconnaissance Office and therefore over the satellite programs. The Air Force, on the other hand, was deeply invested in the State Route 71, not just financially but emotionally and institutionally. Pilots who flew the Blackbird were the elite of the elite, the very pinnacle of what the Air Force could produce in human terms. The State Route 71 was a source of enormous pride, an icon of American technological supremacy, and a symbol of what air power could achieve. So when CIA and NRO officials began arguing that satellites had made the State Route 71 unnecessary, Air Force generals took that argument very personally. And the fight that followed was brutal. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, the State Route 71 survived multiple attempts to cut it from the defense budget. Each time, its defenders, primarily in the Air Force and among senior reconnaissance officials who understood its unique capabilities, managed to preserve the program. They pointed to things that satellites genuinely could not do, at least not at the time. The State Route 71 could be redirected rapidly in response to breaking intelligence requirements. It could fly over a specific target on short notice, something that satellites, constrained by their orbital paths, could not always do. It could carry a wide range of sensors, from cameras to signals intelligence equipment to synthetic aperture radar, that could be swapped out depending on the mission. It operated below cloud cover in ways that optical satellites could not. And it could provide stereo imagery, the kind of three-dimensional coverage that intelligence analysts needed to assess things like missile silo dimensions and military equipment specifications. These were real, genuine advantages, and for years they kept the State Route 71 alive. But the program had a powerful and determined enemy in the form of the budget hawks who surrounded Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger during the Reagan administration, and then even more so in the administration of President George H.W. Bush. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was clearly in its final chapter. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in the Soviet Union and was implementing his policies of glasnost and perestroika. The Soviet threat, while still real, was changing in character. And in this changing strategic environment, the bean counters in the Pentagon and the Office of Management and Budget looked at the State Route 71 program and saw $200,000 per flight hour, saw the massive infrastructure costs, saw the small fleet size, and saw what appeared to be a redundant capability given the capabilities of reconnaissance satellites. In 1989, the decision was made. The State Route 71 was officially retired. The last operational flights were flown in January of that year, and the aircraft were placed in storage. And then something remarkable happened. Something that tells you more about the real reasons for the retirement than any budget document ever could. Almost immediately after the State Route 71 was retired, American military and intelligence operations in the Middle East and elsewhere began encountering situations where they desperately needed exactly the kind of rapid, flexible, high-resolution aerial reconnaissance that only the State Route 71 could provide. In 1990, when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait and the United States began preparing Operation Desert Storm, military commanders found themselves with a significant intelligence gap. Satellites could provide coverage, but they were constrained by their orbital schedules. Slower reconnaissance aircraft were vulnerable to Iraqi air defenses, and the intelligence community found itself wishing, out loud and on the record, that the State Route 71 was still available. The aircraft had been retired less than 2 years earlier, and already its absence was being felt. This created an extraordinary political opening for the SR-71's defenders, who had never accepted the retirement and had been working behind the scenes to reverse it. Led by a coalition of Air Force officers, sympathetic members of Congress, and intelligence officials who understood the aircraft's unique value, they launched a campaign to bring the Blackbird back. And incredibly, they succeeded. In 1995, 6 years after the initial retirement, Congress approved funding to reactivate 3 state Route 71 aircraft. The planes were pulled from storage, refurbished, and returned to operational status with a crew of specially trained pilots. It was an extraordinary moment, a genuine reversal of a major defense acquisition decision, the kind of thing that almost never happens in the world of military procurement. But the second retirement, which came in 1998, was handled very differently from the first. And the manner in which it was handled reveals perhaps more clearly than anything else what was really driving these decisions. This time, the retirement was accompanied by a set of very specific and very deliberate actions designed to make reactivation impossible. The special tooling required to manufacture replacement parts for the state Route 71 was destroyed. The production lines for the JP-7 fuel were shut down. The training infrastructure was dismantled. The Air Force literally made it physically impossible to bring the aircraft back a second time, and did so in a way that could only have been intentional. You don't accidentally destroy specialized tooling. You don't accidentally shut down a unique fuel production capability. These were deliberate choices made by specific people for specific reasons. And those reasons were not primarily about saving money. The real reason the state Route 71 was permanently retired in 1998, and the reason the retirement was made deliberately irreversible, was the emergence of a new generation of reconnaissance technology that made even the most ardent state Route 71 supporter have to concede that the era of the manned reconnaissance aircraft had passed. This new technology had 2 components: dramatically improved satellites and an entirely new class of unmanned reconnaissance aircraft. On the satellite side, by the late 1990s, American reconnaissance satellites had achieved capabilities that were almost incomprehensible compared to what had been available in 1989. Resolution had improved to the point where analysts could distinguish individual people from orbit. Near real-time data transmission had become reliable and routine. The constellation of satellites had expanded to the point where coverage gaps were rare and brief. The remaining advantages of the state Route 71, the ability to respond quickly, the ability to fly below clouds, the ability to collect certain types of electronic signals intelligence, were being systematically addressed by new satellite designs and new collection architectures. But perhaps even more important than the improved satellites was the emergence of a new class of aircraft: high-altitude, long-endurance unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, that could do things no manned aircraft had ever been able to do. The Lockheed U-2 had been flying since the late 1950s and had proven that high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft had extraordinary value. But U-2s required pilots, which meant limited endurance, human physiological constraints, and the ever-present risk of another Gary Powers incident. The development of vehicles like the Global Hawk, which the Air Force was actively funding and developing through the 1990s, promised to eliminate those constraints entirely. A UAV with a powerful reconnaissance payload could fly for more than 30 hours without stopping, could be operated remotely from the continental United States, and could be produced in larger numbers at lower cost than the state Route 71. For the intelligence and military communities, the combination of dramatically improved satellites and increasingly capable UAVs made the case for maintaining the state Route 71 genuinely hard to sustain. There was also a classified dimension to this story that has only been partially revealed even today. During the SR-71's later years, the reconnaissance community was investing heavily in a class of systems known as the Advanced Reconnaissance Systems programs, which included both improved satellites and new concepts for unmanned reconnaissance vehicles that went well beyond the Global Hawk. Some of these programs, operating under classifications that have still not been fully declassified, were specifically designed to replicate and exceed the SR-71's capabilities without the cost, the manpower, and the political risk of a manned aircraft. The people who knew about these classified programs were among the most determined advocates for retiring the State Route 71, because they knew that what was coming would make even the Blackbird's extraordinary capabilities look modest. This created a peculiar situation in public debates about the retirement, where the most knowledgeable advocates for retirement couldn't fully explain their reasoning because the most compelling parts of their argument were classified. There is also an element of this story that touches on something quite human and quite universal: the institutional culture of the United States Air Force and the way that culture shaped the retirement decision. The State Route 71 had always been an anomaly within the Air Force. It was a pure reconnaissance aircraft with no offensive capability whatsoever. It carried no weapons. It dropped no bombs. It could not shoot back if attacked. In the culture of the Air Force, which had always celebrated the fighter pilot and the bomber crew as its primary warrior identities, the reconnaissance mission occupied an ambiguous and sometimes uncomfortable place. The pilots who flew the State Route 71 were extraordinarily skilled and universally respected, but the aircraft itself did not fit neatly into the Air Force's primary self-image. When budget pressures forced painful choices, it was easier for Air Force leadership to sacrifice the Blackbird than it would have been to sacrifice a fighter or a bomber program, because the State Route 71 had fewer passionate advocates among the Air Force's senior leadership than its reputation might suggest. Furthermore, by the late 1980s and early 90s, the Air Force was deeply committed to a new set of priorities that were consuming enormous resources and political capital: stealth technology and precision-guided munitions. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter had entered service in 1983 and had demonstrated capabilities that redefined what air power could accomplish. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was in development and would require enormous investment to bring to operational status. The F-22 Raptor, the next-generation air superiority fighter, was in the early stages of development and would eventually consume billions of dollars. Against this backdrop of massive investments in offensive stealth platforms, the State Route 71 reconnaissance mission was increasingly seen by Air Force planners as something that could and should be handled by other means, freeing up resources for the programs that Air Force leadership considered more central to their institutional identity and their vision of future warfare. Then there is the matter of the specific individuals who made the final retirement decision in 1989 and whose determination to make it irreversible in 1998 shaped everything that followed. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, who served under President George H.W. Bush, was among the most determined advocates for cutting programs he considered redundant. Cheney was a fiscal conservative with a strong skepticism toward what he saw as military services protecting programs for institutional reasons rather than genuine operational necessity. When his staff presented him with analyses suggesting that satellites and other collection systems could adequately replace the State Route 71, he was receptive to those arguments in a way that previous defense secretaries had not been. And Cheney had the political will to override military service objections in a way that was unusual for a Secretary of Defense. At the same time, the intelligence community, particularly elements of the CIA and the National Reconnaissance Office, was actively lobbying for the retirement, arguing that the resources consumed by the State Route 71 program would be better spent on satellite programs that they controlled and that they believed offered superior collection capabilities. This created an unusual alignment of interests. Fiscal conservatives in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, satellite program advocates in the intelligence community, and Air Force planners focused on stealth and precision strike, all pushing in the same direction at the same time. The SR-71's defenders, despite their passion and their genuine operational arguments, were simply outnumbered and outmaneuvered in the bureaucratic battles that determined American defense priorities. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves careful attention, and that is the question of what the SR-71's retirement tells us about the broader transformation of intelligence gathering that was underway in the late 20th century. The entire paradigm of aerial reconnaissance that had defined the Cold War, the idea of flying a specialized aircraft, piloted by a highly trained human being, over a denied area to collect imagery and signals intelligence, was giving way to a new paradigm built on persistent surveillance, networked sensors, and automated collection systems. This transformation was not just technological, it was conceptual. The Cold War model of intelligence had been built around the idea of penetrating specific, high-value targets at specific times, getting in and getting out before the adversary could react. The new model was built around the idea of persistent presence, of watching everything all the time, of building a continuous picture of the adversary's activities rather than collecting snapshots, however extraordinary those snapshots might be. The State Route 71 was a product of the snapshot paradigm at its absolute zenith. It was the ultimate expression of the idea that you could build a platform so extraordinary, so fast, so high-flying, so capable, that it could penetrate any defended airspace and bring back imagery of unsurpassed quality. And it fulfilled that promise magnificently. But by the 1990s, the snapshot paradigm was giving way to the persistent surveillance paradigm. And in that new world, the SR-71's extraordinary performance specifications, its phenomenal speed, its remarkable altitude, its resistance to attack, were becoming less relevant than they had been. What mattered now was not how fast you could get to a target and get back, but how long you could stay, how continuously you could watch, how much data you could collect and transmit in real time. And for that mission, satellites and long-endurance UAVs were simply better tools. This is perhaps the deepest truth about the SR-71's retirement. It was not primarily a story of budget cuts, or institutional rivalry, or political maneuvering, although all of those things played real roles. At its deepest level, it was a story about technological paradigm shift, about an entire way of thinking about intelligence collection becoming obsolete, and the extraordinary aircraft that embodied that way of thinking being retired along with the paradigm it represented. The Blackbird was not defeated. It was not made obsolete in any simple technical sense. It was retired because the questions that military and intelligence planners were asking were changing, and the State Route 71 was an answer to questions that people were no longer asking in the same way. And yet, even today, decades after its final retirement, the State Route 71 Blackbird commands a reverence and fascination that few military aircraft in history can match. The aircraft that replaced it, the satellites and UAVs that the budget analysts said would make it obsolete, cannot inspire the kind of awe that the Blackbird still generates. There is something about a machine that can outrun a missile, that can cross an entire continent in an hour, that can look down on the curvature of the Earth from the edge of space, that touches something deep in the human imagination. Something that a satellite photograph or a drone video, however sharp and however persistent, simply cannot replicate. The people who flew the State Route 71 understood this. The men who sat in those cramped cockpits, sealed inside pressure suits that kept them alive at altitudes where the atmosphere was essentially non-existent, who felt the aircraft accelerate through Mach 1 and Mach 2 and into the sustained Mach 3 cruise that was the Blackbird's natural element. Those men knew they were doing something that no human being before them had ever done, and that very few human beings after them would ever do again. They knew they were flying the most extraordinary aircraft ever built, and they knew it in every fiber of their being every time they strapped in, and the canopy came down, and the engines lit, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Richard Graham, One of the most experienced State Route 71 pilots described flying the aircraft as the closest thing to being a god of the sky that a human being could experience. At full speed and altitude, you were untouchable. Nothing could catch you. Nothing could hurt you. You existed in a realm that was entirely your own, above the weather, above the missiles, above the radar, above everything except the black sky of near space above you and the curving blue and white planet below. The psychological impact of that experience on the men who had it was profound and lasting. Many of them described the years they spent flying the State Route 71 as the peak experience of their lives, something that nothing else they ever did could quite match. And when the aircraft was retired, when the hangars were locked and the keys were put away, those men felt a sense of loss that went beyond the professional. The story of the SR-71's retirement also has an important epilogue that is rarely discussed, and that epilogue involves what happened to American aerial reconnaissance capabilities in the years after the final retirement. The assumption that had driven the retirement, that satellites and UAVs would seamlessly fill the gap left by the Blackbird, turned out to be partially, but not entirely correct. Satellites are constrained by orbital mechanics in ways that create predictable coverage gaps that sophisticated adversaries can exploit by scheduling their most sensitive activities for the periods between satellite passes. Long-endurance UAVs, while enormously capable, are relatively slow and can be threatened by adversary air defenses in ways that the State Route 71, with its phenomenal speed and altitude, was not. In certain high-threat environments, particularly over countries with advanced air defense systems, there are reconnaissance missions that satellites cannot adequately perform and UAVs cannot safely fly, missions that a next-generation State Route 71 could accomplish with relative ease. This recognition has led, in recent years, to renewed interest in high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance platforms within the American defense community. Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works division, the same organization that created the original Blackbird, has been working on a successor concept designated the State Route 72, a hypersonic aircraft intended to fly at Mach 6 or above. The State Route 72 would represent the next evolutionary step in the lineage that began with the U-2, continued through the A-12 and the YF-12 and the State Route 71, and would represent a machine capable of doing everything the Blackbird could do, but faster, and with the added capability of potentially carrying offensive payloads alongside its reconnaissance systems. Whether the State Route 72 will actually be built and fielded remains uncertain, constrained by the extraordinary technical challenges of sustained hypersonic flight and the enormous costs of developing such a radically new aircraft. But the very fact that serious people are seriously pursuing such a concept tells you something important. The retirement of the State Route 71 did not solve the problem that the State Route 71 was solving. It deferred it. It pushed it down the road to a future generation of engineers and pilots and defense planners who would have to figure out how to do what the Blackbird did, only faster and in an environment of even more capable adversary defenses. The lessons of the SR-71's retirement are lessons that the American defense community is still absorbing and debating. One lesson is about the danger of assuming that because a new technology can theoretically replicate the capabilities of an existing one, it will actually be deployed and operated in a way that fills the gap. The transition from manned to unmanned reconnaissance, from aircraft to satellites, turned out to be messier and more incomplete than the retirement's advocates had promised. Another lesson is about the way that institutional rivalries and budget politics can distort defense decisions in ways that end up costing more than they save. The cost of retiring the State Route 71, reactivating it 5 years later, and then retiring it again permanently, combined with the cost of the reconnaissance capability gaps that opened up in the interim, likely exceeded the cost of simply maintaining the program through the 1990s. There is also a lesson about irreversibility. The deliberate destruction of the SR-71 support infrastructure in the late 1990s, the destruction of tooling, the shutdown of fuel production, the dismantling of training programs, was a choice to make the retirement permanent in a way that could not be undone if circumstances changed. And circumstances did change. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the confrontations with North Korea and Iran, the growing assertiveness of China and Russia, all created situations where the rapid, flexible, high-resolution aerial reconnaissance that the State Route 71 provided would have been enormously valuable. But the aircraft was gone, and gone in a way that made bringing it back essentially impossible without building a new one from scratch. The people who made that decision were confident enough in their assumptions about the future of reconnaissance technology to make an irreversible choice. History has shown that at least some of those assumptions were wrong. But perhaps the most important lesson of all is the most human one. The State Route 71 was not just a weapons system or an intelligence collection platform. It was a testament to what human beings can achieve when they are given an audacious goal and the resources and freedom to pursue it. Kelly Johnson and his team at Skunk Works were told to build something that seemed impossible, something faster and higher and more capable than anything that had ever flown, and they did it. They did it in an era without computer-aided design, without digital simulation, without any of the computational tools that modern engineers rely on, and they produced something that no modern engineering team, with all of the resources of the digital age, has yet managed to surpass. The State Route 71 remains, more than half a century after it first flew, the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built. That is an extraordinary testament to the genius of its creators and the skill of the men who flew it. When the last State Route 71 made its final flight, when it descended from that black sky at the edge of space for the last time and rolled to a stop on the runway, and the engines were shut down for the final time, something was lost from the world that has not been replaced. Not the capability, because capabilities can be replicated and exceeded. Not the technology, because technology always moves forward. What was lost was something harder to quantify. A certain kind of boldness, a certain willingness to pursue the impossible and not stop until you had achieved it. A certain relationship between human beings and the machines they create that is hard to sustain in an age of committees and cost overruns and risk-averse procurement bureaucracies. The men and women who built the State Route 71 and the men who flew it inhabited a world where extraordinary things were possible because extraordinary people were given the freedom to try. Whether that world can be recreated in the 21st century, whether the State Route 72 or some other descendant of the Blackbird lineage will once again push the boundaries of what a human-built flying machine can do, remains one of the most fascinating open questions in aviation and defense. But one thing is certain. Whatever comes next, whatever machine eventually earns the right to call itself the heir of the State Route 71, it will have a very, very high standard to meet. Because the Blackbird set a standard that the world has been trying to reach for 60 years, and so far, nothing has come close. The official story says the State Route 71 was retired because it was too expensive. The real story, as you now know, is far more complicated, far more political, and far more fascinating. It is a story about the collision between an extraordinary machine and the bureaucratic, technological, and institutional forces that shape defense policy. It is a story about how even the most capable tool in human history can be made obsolete, not by a better tool, but by changing questions and shifting priorities in the relentless tide of institutional politics. And it is ultimately a story about loss, about what it means when something truly irreplaceable disappears from the world, and about whether we have the wisdom and the courage to learn from that loss before we are confronted with its consequences. So the next time you see a photograph of the State Route 71 Blackbird, that long, black, impossibly elegant machine crouching on the runway like a predatory bird from another dimension, remember what you now know. Remember that what you are looking at is not just an aircraft. It is the physical embodiment of a moment in human history when we reached further than we had ever reached before, flew faster than we had ever flown before, and looked down on our world from a height and a speed that still, to this day, has never been surpassed. And remember that the decision to ground it was not made in a hangar by mechanics or on a runway by pilots. It was made in conference rooms in Washington by men in suits who were balancing budgets and fighting institutional battles and making assumptions about the future that turned out to be only partially correct. The Blackbird deserved better. And perhaps, one day, its successor will get the chance to prove that the spirit of the State Route 71 was never truly grounded. It was only waiting.